Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Psychology. In this session, we will begin our exploration of learning. The session will follow the outline shown, beginning with the question, what is learning? Learning can be defined as a process based on experience that results in a relatively permanent change in behavioral repertoire. That is, it is the acquisition of knowledge, for example, skills, information, attitudes, beliefs, and habits, via practical contact. This definition excludes any behavioral changes that are caused by other things, such as maturation or ingestion of substances. Memory is the persistence of learning over time. Memory can decay over time. Thus, not all learning is permanent. It can fade over time. Hence, skills, abilities can get rusty. Memory traces arise from new connections being made between brain neurons. This growth and reorganization of neural networks is known as brain plasticity. The next question to be addressed is, what are some common forms of learning? There are many forms of learning. Motor learning is acquiring physical skills. This is achieved via practice. Semantic learning is acquiring knowledge. This is achieved by rehearsal or mental cogitation. Habit learning is acquiring automatic routines. This is achieved by repetition. And non-associative learning is habituation and sensitization. Habituation is reacting less and less to a repeated stimulus. One explanation for habituation is that with repeated firing, neurons start emitting less neurotransmitters. Sensitization is reacting more and more to a repeated stimulus. No one knows why sensitization occurs. In the next two sessions, we will go into great detail about two other forms of learning, associative learning and social learning. Associative learning is linking things together in memory. That is, it is making a mental connection between things. We tend to link together things that co-occur. That is, our minds naturally connect things that tend to happen or appear together. For example, most people associate thunder with lightning because the two often co-occur. Some associations do not influence our behavior. However, sometimes associations do influence our behavior. Behavior change induced by associative learning is known as conditioning. We will examine two types of conditioning, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is the process by which a learned association made between two stimuli gives one stimulus the capacity to evoke a reflex, an automatic behavior, similar to the reflex originally evoked by the other. The phenomenon was discovered at approximately the same time by two people, each working independently of the other. Edwin Twittmeyer discovered classical conditioning while studying the knee-jerk reflex at the University of Pennsylvania. He warned participants that they were about to be tapped on the knee by ringing a bell. He noticed that after doing this for a while, participants would start to twitch their legs at the mere sound of the bell. The other, more famous discoverer of classical conditioning was Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who conducted a substantial amount of research into the digestive system. He was interested in the various substances secreted by an animal's digestive system to break down the food eaten. He analysed the chemical composition of the digestive juices, measured the timing of their secretion during the course of a meal, and attempted to discover the neurological mechanisms controlling these responses. In 1904, he was awarded a Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology for this work. One of the digestive juices that Pavlov studied was saliva, the first secretion to make contact with ingested food. The subjects in these studies were dogs. The experimental apparatus for these studies consisted of a harness to restrain the dog and a surgically implanted tube to collect the secretions of the salivary ducts. In testing sessions, a dog would be given food and its salivation recorded as it ate. Pavlov's important observation was that dogs that had been through the testing procedure several times would begin to salivate even before the food was presented. Pavlov reasoned that some stimuli that had regularly preceded the presentation of the food in previous sessions, such as the sight or sound of the experimenter, had now become associated with the presentation of the food, and so was automatically making the dogs salivate. Pavlov spent the rest of his career studying this phenomenon. To conduct a classical conditioning experiment, the researcher first selects a stimulus that naturally elicits an automatic response. This stimulus is known as the unconditioned stimulus, and the response that it evokes is known as the unconditioned response. Unconditioned means that the connection between the stimulus and response is unlearned, it is innate. In Pavlov's experiments, the unconditioned stimulus was food, and the unconditioned response was salivation. Next, the researcher selects a stimulus that does not elicit a reflexive response. This stimulus is known as the conditioned stimulus. Conditioned means that learning will have to take place before it will elicit any response. In Pavlov's experiments, the conditioned stimulus was typically a buzzer, a metronome, or a note played on a harmonium. It is a myth that he used the sound of a bell. The typical classical conditioning trial involves presenting the conditioned stimulus followed by the unconditioned stimulus. Initially, only the unconditioned stimulus will elicit a response. However, after numerous trials, the conditioned stimulus will start to elicit a response. The response elicited by the conditioned stimulus is known as the conditioned response. The conditioned response is usually very similar to the unconditioned response. It is referred to as the conditioned response because it only occurs as a result of learning. Research has identified numerous phenomena linked to classical conditioning. Acquisition refers to the development of a conditioned response. In most classical conditioning studies, several pairings of the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are necessary before the conditioned response becomes fully developed. In order for subjects to learn an association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the two must be presented close together in time, and one must reliably predict the other. For example, a spoiled child would get excited at the sight of ice cream trucks because ice cream trucks arrive a few minutes before they get given an ice cream, and they are always given an ice cream when a truck arrives. Stimulus generalization is the automatic extension of a conditioned response to a stimulus that is similar to the conditioned stimulus. The nervous system automatically responds to similar things in similar ways. The more similar the things are to one another, the more similarly the nervous system will respond to them. For example, a spoiled child would get excited at the sight of a mobile beer truck because a mobile beer truck looks similar to an ice cream truck. Stimulus discrimination is the opposite of stimulus generalization. It is the ability to distinguish between the conditioned stimulus and other stimuli. The ability is learned. The more differences between stimuli there are, the more easily they can be told apart. For example, a spoiled child could learn to spot the difference between an ice cream truck and a beer truck. Extinction is the weakening and perhaps disappearance of a conditioned response. This is achieved by breaking the pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. That is, presenting the conditioned stimulus without presenting the unconditioned stimulus. For example, if a child was no longer brought ice creams from ice cream trucks, then the child would get less and less excited each time he or she saw a truck, until eventually he or she might not get excited at all. Spontaneous recovery refers to the reappearance of a conditioned response sometime after extinction has occurred. That is, if a subject goes through a number of extinction trials until the conditioned response disappears, and this is followed by a passage of time when no trials are carried out, then the next time that the conditioned stimulus is presented, it is likely that the conditioned response will reappear. Spontaneous recovery is proof that extinction does not erase the learning that occurs during acquisition. There are several theories about spontaneous recovery. One of the most popular is inhibition theory. Inhibition theory states that two different associations are learned during acquisition and extinction. During acquisition, the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus is associated with the unconditioned stimulus. During extinction, the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus is not associated with the unconditioned stimulus. Learning that two things are associated is thought to lay down stronger memory traces than learning that two things are not associated. Hence, extinction learning fades more rapidly than acquisition learning. This means that over the passage of time, the extinction learning becomes less and less able to counteract the acquisition learning. For example, a child who had first learned that the arrival of ice cream trucks meant getting ice cream, but then learned that the arrival of ice cream trucks did not mean getting ice cream, would get excited the first time they saw a truck in a while, because the memory of getting ice cream would remain, but the memory of not getting ice cream would have faded. Classical conditioning can affect many types of behavior. Sometimes individuals can be conditioned to respond physically. For example, the original Twittmeyer study conditioned participants to twitch their knees at the sound of a bell, and the original Pavlov studies conditioned subjects to salivate at the sound of a buzzer. Sometimes individuals can be conditioned to respond emotionally. This is known as emotional conditioning. For example, In a very controversial experiment, Watson and Rayner conditioned an 11-month-old baby, known as Little Albert, to be scared of white rats. They did this by making a loud noise behind his back every time he touched a white rat that was placed before him. After a while, Albert became frightened of many furry white objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, and a coat with a furry white collar, as a consequence of stimulus generalization. The study was controversial for many reasons. Firstly, they took Little Albert from the Johns Hopkins University Pediatric Facility without his mother's consent. Secondly, they needlessly and callously terrified a small child. Little Albert is now thought to have been William Albert Barger, the son of Pearl Barger, who worked in the University Pediatric Facility. William Barger died at the age of 87 and was said to have had a phobia of dogs for his entire life. Sometimes individuals can be conditioned to respond judgmentally. This is known as evaluative conditioning. People might like something because they associate it with a pleasant stimulus, or they might dislike it because they associate it with an unpleasant stimulus. For example, in the advert shown, two stimuli are paired, a product and an attractive person. Seeing an attractive person automatically triggers a positive emotion. If a product is often accompanied by images of attractive people, then an association will be learned between the product and the sight of attractive people. This will lead to the product triggering positive emotions similar to those triggered by seeing an attractive person. Experiencing positive emotions at the sight of the product will cause people to like that product.